The wind cut through the Montana plains like 1,000 frozen knives. It was the winter of 1873, the kind that old-timers in Pinecrest whispered about in hushed tones, saying it came only once in a generation. A winter that swallowed men whole and left no trace of them until the spring thaw, if at all. On this night, the storm carried death in its howling voice, and it had set its sights on Abigail Winters. Abby ran through knee-deep snow, her thin boots soaked through each step, heavier than the last. Behind her, the orange glow of torches bobbed like demonic fireflies in the swirling white darkness. The shouts of the mob echoed against the walls of wind. "Run the witch out! Harlot, temptress of married men!" Her lungs burned with each ragged breath. The cold had long ago penetrated her woolen shawl, turning her fingers blue and her face numb. But it was fear, not cold, that drove her forward. Fear of what would happen if they caught her. Abby stumbled on a hidden route and fell face first into the snow. Her small burlap bag tumbled from her grip, spilling its meager contents. With trembling hands she clawed through the snow, desperate to find the one thing she couldn't leave behind. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice lost in the howling wind. "Please." Her fingers closed around the leather binding of the Bible, worn smooth with years of daily reading. Daniel's Bible. Her relief was so profound, she nearly wept. But there was no time. The torches were growing closer. Clutching the sacred book to her chest, Abby abandoned the rest of her scattered belongings and pushed forward into the white void of the Montana wilderness. Just hours earlier, Abby had been in her small rented room above the seamstress shop where she worked. The late afternoon light had filtered through the window as she carefully stitched the final details on Judge Blackwood's new coat, an expensive commission that would have paid her rent for 2 months. The knock at her door had been sharp, authoritative. "Mrs. Winters, open up, please." The landlady's voice had an edge Abby had never heard before. When she opened the door, Mrs. Peterson stood with 2 men from the town council and the sheriff. Behind them, peering up the narrow staircase with undisguised malice, was Mrs. Blackwood, the judge's wife. "Pack your things," Mrs. Peterson had said, her eyes not meeting Abby's. "You need to be gone by sundown." "What?" "Why, I've paid through the month." Sheriff Mills had cleared his throat. "Mrs. Winters, there have been accusations about your character." Mrs. Blackwood had pushed forward, then her expensive dress rustling. "Don't play innocent. I know what you've been doing with my husband during those fittings. A decent woman would be ashamed." Abby's face had flushed with anger and humiliation. "That's not true. I've never—" "She was seen," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted, adjusting his trousers in a most inappropriate manner. "I was measuring for his suit," Abby protested. The truth was far more unsettling. The judge had made advances, putting his hand on her waist, and she had firmly stepped back and reminded him of his position and her professional boundaries. But the decision had already been made. In Pinecrest, a widow with no family had no one to speak for her, and the wife of the most powerful man in town had all the voice she needed. "We don't harbor women of loose morals in Pinecrest," one of the councilmen had said, looking almost apologetic. "Best you move on to another town." "In this weather?" Abby had asked, gesturing toward the window where snow was already beginning to fall heavily. "You can't be serious." But they were. Within an hour, Abby had been forced to pack what little she could carry and was pushed out into the gathering storm, the door of the only home she'd known since Daniel's death locked firmly behind her. Now, as darkness fell completely and the temperature plummeted, Abby knew she was dying. The voices of the mob had faded. Either they had given up or she had somehow outpaced them. but the victory was hollow. She had escaped one death only to face another slower and more painful. Her legs moved mechanically without direction or purpose. The storm had disoriented her completely. She could be walking in circles for all she knew. In her half-frozen mind, memories flickered like candles. Daniel on their wedding day, his kind eyes crinkling as he smiled. The small clinic where he had treated the sick of Pinecrest, never turning anyone away regardless of their ability to pay. The night he had fallen ill, his skin burning with fever, as he clutched her hand and whispered, "Be careful, Abby. Trust no one." She had assumed it was the fever talking. Now she wondered. Abby fell again, and this time she couldn't find the strength to rise. The snow felt almost warm now, a dangerous sign she knew from Daniel's teachings. The cold was seducing her toward sleep, toward death. "Daniel," she whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. "I'm coming to you." Through the curtain of falling snow, a shape emerged, dark and solid, against the endless white. At first, Abby thought it was a hallucination, her dying mind conjuring comfort in her final moments. But as she blinked away the ice crystals forming on her eyelashes, she realized it was real. A barn. Hope surged through her frozen body, giving her one last burst of strength. On hands and knees, she crawled toward the structure, each movement agony. When she reached the large wooden door, her fingers were too numb to grip the handle properly. She leaned her full weight against it, and mercifully it swung open. The sudden absence of howling wind was shocking. Inside, the air still bit with cold, but it was a bearable cold. The smell of hay and horses filled her nostrils, and somewhere in the darkness, she heard the shuffling of hooves. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, crawling deeper into the shelter. Abby managed to pull herself into a stall filled with fresh hay. She burrowed into it, clutching Daniel's Bible to her chest. As consciousness began to slip away, she thought she heard footsteps approaching, the creak of the barn door opening again. But by then, darkness had claimed her. Ezra Hartfield had been checking the livestock when he first heard the barn door move. In the howling Montana winter, a loose door could mean dead animals by morning, and dead animals meant no income come spring. He'd grabbed his lantern and rifle and trudged through the snow from his cabin, cursing the relentless storm. At 38, Ezra was no stranger to harsh winters. He'd lived on this land for over a decade, working at first with Sarah, then alone after he'd lost her and their unborn child 3 years ago. The solitude suited him now. After what had happened after losing his faith, he preferred the honest company of his horses and cattle to the whispers and sidelong glances of townspeople. The lantern light swept across the barn interior as he entered, rifle held ready. Last winter, he'd sheltered a traveler caught in a storm, only to wake and find the man gone along with Ezra's best horse. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Who's there?" His voice echoed in the cavernous space. The horses nickered in response, but nothing else moved. Ezra advanced cautiously, checking each stall. When he reached the last one, his lantern illuminated a bundle in the hay that made him step back in surprise. It wasn't a drifter or a thief. It was a woman. She lay curled on her side, a small figure nearly buried in hay. Her dress was soaked through her skin, frighteningly pale in the lantern light. A book was clutched to her chest, with fingers that had turned an alarming shade of blue. For a moment, Ezra hesitated. A woman alone on his property, it would mean talk if anyone found out. The people of Pinecrest already viewed him with suspicion since he'd abandoned his position as their pastor. They wouldn't understand. Then the woman made a small, pained sound barely audible, and something broke loose in Ezra's chest. "The Lord placed her in my hands," he murmured, the first time he'd invoked God in years. The words felt strange on his tongue, like speaking a language long forgotten. Setting the lantern down, he knelt beside her. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, her pulse faint. She was moments from death. With a decision made, Ezra scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had already begun to hollow her out. He retrieved his lantern and carried her through the blizzard toward his cabin, the wind fighting him every step of the way. Inside, he laid her before the hearth and built up the fire until it roared. He piled every blanket he owned atop her, but as the minutes passed, her skin remained gray and lifeless. Ezra had seen this before during his years on the frontier. When the cold went deep enough, blankets alone wouldn't save a life. What was needed was the warmth of another body. The thought made him pause. It was improper, a man and woman strangers to each other. If she survived, what would she think? What would others say? But propriety wouldn't keep her alive. With practiced efficiency, Ezra removed her wet clothing, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible to preserve her dignity. He saw, despite his efforts, not to look the simple gold band on her finger. A married woman, or a widow, like himself. He changed into dry clothes, then lay beside her, pulling the blankets over them both. Her skin was so cold, it burned against his. He held her close, willing his warmth into her frozen body. "Don't give up," he whispered. "Fight." As he held the stranger in his arms, Ezra found himself doing something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He prayed. It wasn't an elegant prayer. His years as a pastor seemed a lifetime ago, and the words came haltingly rusty from disuse. "Lord," he whispered, "if you're still listening to me after all this time, save her. I don't know who she is or why she's here, but I'm asking you to spare her life." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something shifted. The woman in his arms gave a small shudder, then another. Her breathing deepened slightly. Ezra continued to hold her through the long night, dozing, fitfully alert to every change in her condition. By dawn, color had returned to her cheeks, and her body had begun to tremble with shivers, a good sign, though it likely meant pain for her. When the first light of morning filtered through the cabin windows, her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep blue, the color of summer cornflowers, and filled with confusion and fear. She gasped and tried to pull away, but she was too weak to move far. "Easy," Ezra said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're safe. I found you half frozen in my barn. I brought you inside." The woman's gaze darted around the cabin, then down at herself, realizing she was wearing one of his shirts. Horror crossed her face. "My clothes were soaked through. I had to remove them to save your life, but I was as proper as circumstances allowed." Ezra stood and moved away from the bed, giving her space. "I'll turn my back while you wrap yourself in the blankets. Then we can talk." When he turned back, she had pulled the quilt up to her chin, her face flushed with embarrassment or fever, he couldn't tell which. "I'm Ezra Heartfelt," he said. "This is my ranch." The woman hesitated before answering. "Abigail Winters? Most people call me Abby." Ezra's heart skipped a beat at the name. He knew it knew her, or of her at least. "Mrs. Winters," he said carefully. "The seamstress from Pinecrest." Fear flashed across her face. "How do you— I know who you are." Ezra interrupted. "I know your husband was Dr. Daniel Winters and that he died 2 years ago. And I know the people of Pinecrest drove you out based on false accusations." Abby stared at him, speechless. "Your husband treated my wife Sarah before she died," Ezra continued. "He was a good man, one of the few truly good men I've known." Tears welled in Abby's eyes. "Yes, he was." Ezra took a deep breath, knowing his next words would change everything. I also know he didn't die of the epidemic like everyone believes. The color drained from Abby's face. What are you saying? I'm saying your husband was murdered, Mrs. Winters, and I believe the same man who killed him was responsible for my Sarah's death as well. The statement hung in the air between them, terrible and transformative. Abby felt as though the room were spinning around her. She gripped the blankets tighter, trying to anchor herself. That's not possible, she whispered, though even as she said it, memories surfaced Daniel's growing agitation in the weeks before his death. His cryptic warnings, the strange symptoms that didn't match the epidemic claiming other lives in Pinecrest. I wish it weren't true, Ezra said, his voice heavy with a grief that matched her own. But I've spent the last 2 years gathering evidence. Your husband suspected something was wrong with the medicine Judge Blackwood was providing to certain patients. He was investigating when he suddenly fell ill. Judge Blackwood. Abby's mind raced back to the man who had commissioned so many garments from her over the years, whose wife had just accused her of impropriety. But why would he? Power, Ezra said simply, and fear of losing it. And he moved to stoke the fire, giving Abby a moment to process. She watched him, this stranger who had saved her life, and now claimed to know the truth about her husband's death. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. His sandy brown hair was flecked with gray at the temples, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as the winter sky, and filled with a sorrow that seemed bottomless. You said the judge was responsible for your wife's death too, Abby said finally. How? Ezra's shoulders tensed. Sarah was pregnant with our first child. She developed complications. The judge gave her medicine, said it would ease her pain. His voice grew tight. Instead, it killed her and our unborn daughter. I'm so sorry, Abby whispered. Ezra nodded once sharply, as if accepting her sympathy, but unwilling to dwell on it. Rest now, Mrs. Winters. You're still recovering from severe cold. We can talk more when you're stronger. The Bible, Abby said, suddenly remembering. I had Daniel's Bible with me. It's here. Ezra retrieved the book from a shelf and handed it to her. I dried it by the fire. Abby clutched it to her chest, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you. It's all I have left of him. Something softened in Ezra's expression. You're safe here for now. The storm's still raging, likely will for days. No one from town will brave it to look for you, and even if they did, they wouldn't come this far out. As if to confirm his words, the wind howled against the cabin walls, making the windows rattle. Why are you helping me? Abby asked. You don't know me. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Because Daniel Winters once saved my life, and I couldn't save his. The least I can do is help his widow. He moved toward the door. I need to check the animals. Try to sleep. There's broth warming on the stove when you're ready for it. After he left, Abby lay back against the pillows, overwhelmed. Her body ached from the ordeal of nearly freezing to death, but it was her mind that truly reeled. Could it be true? Had Daniel been murdered, and if so, what did that mean for her? Outside, the blizzard continued its assault. But here in this stranger's cabin, she was warm, and for the moment, safe. Abby closed her eyes, the weight of Daniel's Bible on her chest, a comfort, as she drifted into an exhausted sleep. When Abby woke again, the light had changed. It was late afternoon, judging by the golden glow filtering through the cabin windows. The fire still crackled in the hearth, and someone had placed a steaming mug on the small table beside the bed. She sat up cautiously, testing her strength. Her body protested with a chorus of aches, but she managed to reach for the mug. The broth inside was rich and savory, warming her from within as she sipped it. Taking stock of her surroundings, Abby noted the cabin was small but well built. A main room with the hearth, a kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and the bed where she now sat. 2 doors led to what she assumed were other rooms. Simple furnishings, but everything was neat and orderly. On the wall opposite the bed hung a large wooden cross, the kind that would be found in a church. It seemed strangely out of place in this frontier cabin. The door opened, bringing a swirl of snow and cold air, before Ezra quickly shut it behind him. He stamped his boots and removed his heavy coat. "You're awake," he observed. "Good. How are you feeling?" "Better," Abby said. "Thank you for the broth." Ezra nodded, moving to the stove. "There's more if you want it, and I can find you some clothes. They'll be too big, but they're dry." "I'd appreciate that." Abby hesitated, then gestured toward the cross. "Are you a religious man, Mr. Hartfield?" A shadow passed over his face. "I was once." The cross. A reminder of what I left behind. His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Abby changed the subject. "You said my husband saved your life." Ezra dished up more broth and brought it to her. 3 years ago, I was caught in a storm while hunting. Developed pneumonia. Your husband treated me, stayed by my side for 2 days, until the fever broke. He sat in a chair near the bed. He was a dedicated physician, and a perceptive one. "What do you mean?" He asked questions, noticed things others missed. Ezra's gaze grew distant. After Sarah died, he was the only one who seemed suspicious. Everyone else accepted that she died from complications of childbirth. But Daniel, he asked to see the medicine the judge had prescribed. Abby's fingers tightened around the mug. Daniel kept notes on all his patients, in the margins of his Bible. "I know. I've seen some of them. He showed me when he was investigating Sarah's death." Setting the mug down, Abby opened the Bible. The margins were filled with Daniel's neat handwriting observations, treatments, patient names. She turned to the back pages where he had written more extensively. "Here," she said, finding an entry dated shortly before his death. "He mentions a suspicion about a medication causing unusual symptoms. He doesn't name the patient, just uses initials S.H. "Sarah Hartfield," Ezra confirmed grimly. Abby continued reading, her blood running cold at the next notation. "Judge B prevented further investigation. Warned me to drop the matter. Why, he knew," she whispered. "Daniel suspected something was wrong and they silenced him." Ezra's expression hardened. "And now they've driven you out as well. The question is why, after all this time?" Abby thought of Judge Blackwood's unwanted advances, his wife's accusations. I think the judge may have been afraid I knew something. He's been commissioning a lot of work from me lately, coming for multiple fittings, asking questions about Daniel and what he might have told me. And then he orchestrated your removal from town when you didn't reveal anything," Ezra concluded. "Or perhaps when you rebuffed him." Abby nodded, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. "What do we do now?" Ezra stood, moving to stoke the fire. "For now, nothing. You recover. The storm passes. Then we decide our next move." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Unless you'd prefer to move on to another town once the road's clear." The question hung between them. The logical choice would be to leave to start fresh, somewhere far from Pinecrest and its dangerous secrets. But something held Abby back, a sense that running would mean Daniel had died for nothing. "I want to know the truth," she said finally. About Daniel, about your wife, about what Judge Blackwood is hiding. Ezra studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then we'll find it together. He moved toward one of the doors. I'll find you those clothes now. There's water heating if you'd like to wash up. I'll give you privacy. After he left, Abby sat in the stillness listening to the storm outside. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt a sense of purpose. And for the first time since being cast out of Pinecrest, she felt something else, a flutter of hope. Days passed, and the blizzard showed no signs of relenting. Abby and Ezra fell into an uneasy rhythm of coexistence. He gave her his bed and slept on a pallet near the fire. During the days, he tended to the animals and kept the cabin warm while she recovered her strength. They spoke little at first, each wary of the other despite their shared connection through tragedy. Abby learned that Ezra ventured into town, rarely preferring his solitude. The ranch provided most of what he needed, and for the rest, he traded with a nearby Blackfoot tribe rather than dealing with the people of Pinecrest. They helped me when Sarah died, he explained one evening as they ate a simple dinner of venison stew. Their medicine man Greyhawk tried to save her when he realized what was happening, but it was too late. The Blackfoot trusted Daniel too, Abby said. They would come to him instead of the new doctor in town. He learned some of their healing methods. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Abby found herself studying Ezra when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved with surprising gentleness for their size, the furrow between his brows that seemed permanent, the occasional glimpse of the man he might have been before grief carved him into this solitary figure. On the fourth day, Abby was strong enough to move around the cabin freely. She insisted on cooking using the simple provisions available to make bread and stew. As she worked, she noticed Ezra watching her from where he sat cleaning his rifle. "What is it?" she asked. "You remind me of someone," he said, then seemed to regret the words immediately. "Your wife," he nodded once, returning his attention to the rifle. "Tell me about her," Abby said gently. "Sarah. What was she like?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up, he began to speak. She loved the stars. On clear nights, no matter how cold, she'd insist on going outside to look at them. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She said they were God's way of reminding us that there's always light even in the darkest times. Abby moved to sit across from him. "She sounds like a woman of faith." She was. Stronger than mine in the end. He set the rifle aside. "She never questioned why God would take our child. I couldn't stop questioning." "That's why you left the church," Abby guessed, remembering the cross on the wall. Ezra's gaze snapped to hers. "How did you know I was with the church?" "The cross. The way you speak sometimes. And there's a clerical collar in the chest by the door. I saw it when I was looking for thread to mend my dress." He was silent for a long moment. "I was the pastor in Pinecrest for 5 years. After Sarah died, I couldn't stand before the congregation and speak of God's mercy anymore. So I left." "And they let you go just like that?" "Not just like that, no." Bitterness edged his voice. "There were discussions. Attempts to persuade me to stay. But, in the end, what could they do? You can't force a man to preach what he no longer believes." Abby thought of her own faith tested, but not broken by Daniel's death. "Do you miss it, being a pastor?" "I miss the man I was then," Ezra said quietly. "I miss believing that the world makes sense, that good is rewarded and evil punished." "But you still wear the wedding ring," Abby observed. "You still keep the cross on your wall." "Some habits are hard to break." He stood abruptly. I need to check the barn before dark." After he left, Abby remained by the fire thinking about the complexities of the man who had saved her life. A former pastor who had lost his faith, but not his compassion. A widower who still wore his ring and spoke of his wife with tender reverence. A recluse who had nevertheless taken in a stranger in need. And now it seemed a man determined to uncover a murderer. As she rose to continue preparing their meal, Abby noticed a door at the end of the short hallway, the one door in the cabin she hadn't opened. Unlike the others, this one had a lock. She approached it curiously, but before she could investigate further, the outer door opened and Ezra returned in a swirl of snow. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, stamping his boots. "If it keeps up, we'll need to bring the weakest calf inside tonight." Abby moved away from the locked door, but not before Ezra noticed her interest. His expression darkened. "That room is private," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Please respect that." Abby nodded, embarrassed at being caught snooping. "Of course. I'm sorry." The tension between them lingered through dinner, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were sitting before the fire afterward, Ezra reading and Abby mending her dress, that he spoke again. "It was Sarah's room," he said, not looking up from his book. "Her things are in there. I can't." "You don't have to explain," Abby said softly. "I understand." And she did. Didn't she still have a trunk of Daniel's belongings that she couldn't bear to part with? Grief had its own timeline, its own rituals of remembrance. Ezra closed his book. "It's getting late. You should take the bed." "I've been thinking about that," Abby said. "I can't keep displacing you from your own bed. The pallet by the fire is comfortable enough for me." "Absolutely not. You're still recovering." "I'm much better now thanks to your care. Please, I insist." They argued back and forth for several minutes. Before reaching a compromise, Abby would take the bed for 2 more nights, and then they would switch. As she settled under the quilts that night, listening to Ezra's steady breathing from his place by the fire, Abby reflected on how quickly life could change. A week ago, she had been a respected seamstress in Pinecrest. Then in the span of a day, she had become an outcast, nearly died in a blizzard, and been rescued by a man who claimed her husband had been murdered. Now she found herself drawn into a mystery that might put her own life at risk if they pursued it. The sensible thing would be to leave as soon as the roads cleared to start fresh elsewhere. But as sleep claimed her, Abby knew she wouldn't run. Daniel had died seeking the truth. She owed it to him to finish what he had started. And perhaps in the process, she could help a former pastor find his way back to the light. That night, Abby dreamed of Daniel. He stood at the foot of her bed, his kind face troubled. "Be careful, Abby," he said, just as he had in his final hours. "The judge knows more than he should. Trust no one." She reached for him, but he faded like morning mist, leaving only an echo. Trust no one. Abby woke with a start, her heart pounding. The cabin was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Outside, the wind had stopped the sudden silence more startling than the noise had been. From somewhere in the darkness came a sound that raised the hair on her arms. Ezra's voice, low and anguished. "No, Sarah, don't drink it. Please don't." Abby slipped from the bed and moved cautiously toward the sound. Ezra lay on his pallet, thrashing in the grip of a nightmare. His face was contorted in pain, sweat beading on his brow, despite the chill in the room. "Ezra," she called softly, hesitant to touch him. "Ezra, wake up. You're dreaming." He didn't respond, lost in whatever horror his mind had conjured. With gentle firmness, Abby placed her hand on his shoulder and shook him. "Ezra, it's Abby. You're having a nightmare." His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a terrifying moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then awareness returned, and he sat up abruptly. "Abby," he gasped. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" "It's all right," she said, moving to add wood to the fire. "You were having a bad dream." "Yes." He ran a hand over his face. "It's always the same one." In the growing firelight, Abby could see the haunted look in his eyes. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ezra was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the flames, he began to speak. "In the dream, I'm with Sarah. She's in pain from the pregnancy complications. The judge brings the medicine, says it will help her rest." His voice grew hollow. "I watch her drink it. Every time I try to stop her, but I can't move, can't speak. And then she starts to convulse." Abby's heart ached for him. "It wasn't your fault, Ezra. Wasn't it?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I brought the medicine to her. I trusted the judge. I was her husband. I was supposed to protect her." "You didn't know." "I should have." The self-recrimination in his voice was a tangible thing. Daniel suspected something was wrong with the judge's medicines. If I had listened to him sooner, if I had questioned— Abby moved to sit beside him. "We can't change the past. Believe me, I've tried. After Daniel died, I went over every moment of his illness, wondering what I could have done differently. And nothing brought him back." She stared into the fire. "But we can honor them by finding the truth, by making sure no one else suffers the same fate." Ezra studied her in the firelight. "You're a strong woman, Abigail Winters." "I've had to be." And she offered a small smile. "And please call me Abby. Only the town council and Mrs. Blackwood called me Abigail, and that was never a good sign." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Abby, then." They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire dance. The storm had passed, leaving an almost unearthly quiet in its wake. "The stars will be out tonight," Ezra said suddenly. "First time in days. Your wife would have liked that." "Yes," he agreed softly. "She would have." As dawn approached, they remained by the fire, neither returning to sleep, both lost in memories of the loved ones they had lost and the questions that still needed answers. The next day dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off endless expanses of snow. After breakfast, Ezra bundled up to check the damage from the storm and tend to the animals. Abby, feeling stronger, insisted on helping. "You're still recovering," he protested. "I've been cooped up for days," she countered. "Fresh air will do me good, and I'm not made of porcelain." Reluctantly, he lent her some of his clothes: trousers, a heavy shirt, and a coat that engulfed her small frame. With her own boots and a borrowed hat and gloves, she followed him outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but it was a clean, bright cold, not the deadly chill of the blizzard. The ranch spread before them, pristine white in every direction. In the distance, pine-covered mountains rose against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. "It's beautiful." Abby breathed her words, forming clouds in the air. "It can be," Ezra agreed, "when it's not trying to kill you." They made their way to the barn, where Ezra showed her how to check the animals and distribute feed. The work was hard but satisfying, and Abby welcomed the physical activity after days of rest. As they worked side by side, she found herself watching Ezra, the gentleness with which he handled a newborn calf, the quiet words of encouragement he murmured to a nervous mare. For a man who claimed to have lost his faith, he still treated God's creatures with remarkable tenderness. "You're good with them," she observed. Ezra shrugged. "Animals are honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Unlike people." unlike most people I've known. He paused in his work. Your husband was an exception. So was Sarah. And what about me? Abby asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Ezra considered her for a long moment. I'm still deciding. Despite the chill warmth crept into Abby's cheeks. She turned away, focusing on her task. After the barn, Ezra showed her the rest of the property, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the small orchard now dormant under snow. Behind the cabin, partially sheltered by pine trees, she spotted what looked like a tiny fenced graveyard. Is that? She began, but couldn't finish the question. Ezra's expression closed. Yes, Sarah and our daughter Emma. She never drew breath, but we named her anyway. Abby stood silent, respecting his grief. After a moment, Ezra continued walking, and she followed, casting one last glance at the small plot where his family rested. By midday, they had completed the necessary chores, and Ezra suggested they return to the cabin for a meal. As they approached, Abby noticed fresh tracks in the snow, too small for a man's boots. Someone's been here, she said, alarmed. Ezra followed her gaze and relaxed. Greyhawk, he said. The Blackfoot medicine man I mentioned. He checks on me after big storms. Inside the cabin, evidence of the visitor confirmed Ezra's words. A package wrapped in deerskin sat on the table containing dried herbs, berries, and what looked like medicinal roots. He knew I had company, Ezra said, examining the contents. These are healing herbs for someone recovering from the cold. How could he know that? Ezra smiled slightly. Greyhawk has ways of knowing things. Some call it magic. I think it's just wisdom and observation. As Abby prepared a simple meal, she thought about this strange, isolated life Ezra had built for himself, removed from the town that had been his congregation, finding companionship instead with the native people and his animals. It was a life born of grief and disillusionment, yet not without its own kind of dignity. Over lunch, she broached a subject that had been on her mind. Ezra, when the road's clear, what happens next with our investigation? He set down his cup. I've been gathering evidence for 2 years, but it's circumstantial at best. Notes from Daniel about suspicious symptoms. My own observations about Sarah's death. Nothing concrete enough to accuse a judge of murder. But if we combined what we know, Abby mused, Daniel's Bible contains more than just those few notes I showed you. He had a code he used for sensitive information. Ezra's interest sharpened. Can you decipher it? Some of it. We used it to pass private messages during his rounds when he didn't want patients overhearing sensitive information. That could be valuable. Ezra leaned forward. But Abby, you need to understand the risk. If Blackwood killed Daniel for asking questions, he wouldn't hesitate to do the same to you, to us. Abby thought of the mob that had driven her from town, of Daniel's final warning. The danger was real, but so was her determination. I understand the risk, she said firmly. But I need to know the truth. I need justice for Daniel. Ezra studied her, his gray eyes searching. Then we proceed carefully. When the snow melts enough for travel, I'll go into town for supplies and information. You'll stay here where it's safe. But no arguments on this, Abby. They're looking for you, not me. I can move about freely. She wanted to protest, but knew he was right. Fine, but promise me you'll be careful. I'm always careful. He rose from the table. Now, let's see what we can decipher from Daniel's Bible. They spent the afternoon poring over the coded notations in the margins of the sacred text. Some were simple, patient observations, but others, particularly in the Psalms, contained more disturbing information. Here, Abby said, pointing to a notation beside Psalm 64. He writes about a pattern of unusual deaths among the judge's political opponents. And here, she flipped to Proverbs, he mentions suspicions about the medicine the judge provided to a pregnant woman who lost her baby. Sarah wasn't the only one, Ezra said grimly. There were others. As darkness fell, they continued their work by lamplight, piecing together the evidence Daniel had gathered. A pattern emerged, one of strategic deaths and convenient inheritances of silenced opponents and consolidated power. The judge has been poisoning people for years, Abby whispered, horrified, and getting away with it because he controls the law in Pinecrest. And because no one wanted to believe it, Ezra added, including me, until it was too late. They sat in silence, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy between them. Outside, the temperature dropped sharply as night deepened. Abby shivered, despite the fire's warmth. We should rest, Ezra said, closing the Bible carefully. Tomorrow, we can continue. That night, as Abby lay in bed listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold, she thought about the man sleeping by the fire. Ezra Hartfield, who had lost everything, his wife, his child, his faith, his calling, yet still found the courage to seek justice. Who had saved her life, and now risked his own to help her find the truth. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer for Daniel, for Sarah and Emma, for Ezra's wounded soul, and for strength to face whatever lay ahead. And somewhere in the vast Montana night, she felt certain that Daniel heard her. The days that followed brought a gradual thaw. Snow melted from the cabin roof in steady drips, forming icicles that sparkled in the winter sun. Paths cleared enough for easier movement around the ranch, though the road to town remained impassable for wagons. Abby and Ezra fell into a rhythm, sharing tasks and meals, continuing their investigation into Daniel's notes. Each day their partnership deepened, not just in their mutual quest for justice, but in the small moments that built trust. Ezra teaching Abby to shoot his old rifle, Abby mending Ezra's worn clothes with her skilled hands. Quiet evenings by the fire, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in companionable silence. On the 7th day after the storm, they ventured further from the cabin than before. The brilliant blue sky and strengthening February sun made the day almost pleasant, despite the lingering chill. "There's something I want to show you," Ezra said after they'd finished the morning chores. He led her past the barn to a gentle slope where the snow had partially melted, revealing patches of earth. At the top stood a small, simple structure, a chapel, Abby realized as they drew closer. "You built this?" she asked, taking in the handcrafted wooden cross above the door. Ezra nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "When we first settled here before I became pastor in town, Sarah wanted a place to worship when weather prevented us from making the journey to Pinecrest." He pushed open the door, which creaked on rarely used hinges. Inside the chapel was plain but beautiful. 6 short pews faced a simple altar. A large window behind the altar allowed light to stream in, illuminating the space with a golden glow. Abby moved slowly down the center aisle, feeling as though she'd stepped into a sacred moment. "It's lovely," she said softly. "It hasn't been used in 3 years." Ezra remained by the door as if reluctant to enter fully. "Not since you lost your faith," Abby finished for him. He met her eyes across the small space. "How can a man of God continue to preach when God has turned his back on him?" The pain in his voice made Abby's heart ache. She understood his anger, his sense of betrayal. After Daniel died, she too had questioned why God would take a good man who helped so many. But unlike Ezra, she had eventually found her way back to faith, not the same innocent belief she'd had before, but something tempered stronger for having been tested. Maybe she said carefully. It wasn't God who turned away. Ezra's jaw tightened. You didn't see Sarah suffering. You didn't hear her cries of pain. You didn't watch her and our unborn child slip away while I stood helpless, prayers dying on my lips. No, Abby acknowledged. Just as you didn't watch Daniel fade day by day, his brilliant mind clouded by poison, unable to save the man who had saved so many others. She moved toward him. We've both witnessed terrible things, Ezra. Things that test faith to its breaking point. And yet, you still believe. I believe God weeps with us in our suffering, she said simply. I don't believe he causes it. Ezra shook his head. A convenient theology. No, a necessary one. Abby gestured to the chapel around them. You built this place as an act of love and faith. Whatever you feel now, this stands as testimony to the man you were, the man you still are beneath the grief. Ezra didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted. Not acceptance, but perhaps the first crack in a wall built of pain and disillusionment. They left the chapel in silence, each lost in thought. As they walked back toward the cabin, Abby glanced at the small cemetery where Sarah and Emma rested. On impulse, she stopped. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the graves. Surprise flickered across Ezra's face, followed by a guarded nod. Abby approached the two markers, one larger one, heartbreakingly small. Fresh pine boughs had been laid across them recently, a touching sign of Ezra's continued devotion. She knelt in the snow beside them, removed her glove, and traced the carved names with her fingertips. Sarah Hartfield, beloved wife. Emma Hartfield, with God before her first breath. Closing her eyes, Abby began to recite the 23rd Psalm, her voice soft but clear in the winter stillness. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. When she opened her eyes, she found Ezra standing beside her, tears streaming silently down his weathered face. It was the first time she had seen him cry. Without thinking, she reached up and took his hand in hers. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers, holding on as if she were a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. They stood that way for a long moment, connected in grief. And something else, something neither was ready to name. Finally, Ezra spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I haven't cried for them since the funeral. Sometimes tears are prayers when we have no words, Abby said gently. He helped her to her feet, their hands still joined. For a heartbeat, they stood close enough that Abby could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath in the cold air. Then, with obvious reluctance, Ezra released her hand and stepped back. We should return to the cabin. The temperature's dropping. As they walked back, Abby was acutely aware of the distance between them, physical and otherwise. Ezra had allowed her a glimpse of his wounded heart, but she sensed the walls rebuilding even as they approached the cabin. Yet something had changed. A connection had formed, fragile, but real. And in that connection, Abby felt the first stirrings of something she had believed lost forever. When Daniel died, hope. That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Ezra brought out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. I don't usually indulge, he said, pouring a small amount into each glass. But tonight, I find myself in need of it. Abby accepted the glass, though she rarely drank spirits. To Sarah and Emma, she said, raising it slightly, and to Daniel. To those we've lost. Ezra agreed, his eyes reflecting the firelight. They sipped in silence, the whiskey burning a warm path down Abby's throat. She watched the play of emotions across Ezra's face, sensing he had something more to say. Finally, he spoke. "I owe you an apology, Abby." "For what?" "For my bitterness. For imposing it on you." He stared into his glass. "What you said in the chapel today, it made me realize how selfish my grief has been." "Grief isn't selfish, Ezra. It's human." "Perhaps, but I've allowed it to consume me, to define me." He looked up at her. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. Neither would Daniel, I suspect." Abby thought of her late husband, his compassion, his belief in healing bodies and souls. No, he wouldn't have. Daniel believed in moving forward even through pain, especially through pain. He was a wise man. Ezra set his glass down. "I've been thinking about our next steps. The road to town should be passable on horseback within a day or two. I need to go in for supplies and to gather information." "I'm coming with you," Abby said firmly. Ezra shook his head. "It's too dangerous. If anyone recognizes you—" "They drove me out in a blizzard, Ezra. They likely believe I'm dead, which gives us an advantage." She leaned forward. "Besides, I know things about the town, about the people, that you don't. I've been mending their clothes, listening to their gossip for years." He considered this, clearly torn between protecting her and acknowledging the logic of her argument. "I know how to disguise myself," Abby continued. "I was a seamstress. Remember, I can alter my appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition. And if Judge Blackwood sees you, I'll stay away from the courthouse and his home. We'll be careful." Ezra still looked unconvinced. "It's a risk." "Life is a risk," Abby countered. "Daniel took one investigating the judge. Now it's my turn to be brave." After a long moment, Ezra nodded reluctantly. "We'll go together then, but at the first sign of trouble we leave." "Agreed." "Agreed." Abby raised her glass again. "To being brave." The corner of Ezra's mouth lifted in a half-smile. "To being brave," he echoed, touching his glass to hers. Later, as Abby prepared for bed, she found herself humming softly a hymn she and Daniel had often sung together. It had been so long since music had naturally risen within her that the sound surprised her. From his pallet by the fire, Ezra listened, his eyes closed. "You have a beautiful voice," he said when she finished. "Thank you." Abby felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Daniel and I used to sing together in the evenings. Sarah loved music too." A note of wistfulness entered his voice. "She played the piano at church. Not very well, mind you. She'd miss notes and then laugh about it, but with such joy that no one cared." Abby smiled at the image. "She sounds wonderful." She was. For once, the memory seemed to bring Ezra comfort rather than pain. "Good night, Abby." "Good night, Ezra." As she drifted toward sleep, Abby realized something that both thrilled and terrified her in the soft firelight. With shared memories and quiet understanding between them, she had felt the first stirrings of attraction to Ezra Hartfield. The realization should have brought guilt. Daniel had been dead only 2 years, but instead she felt a sense of gentle permission, as if Daniel himself were telling her it was all right to open her heart again. With that comforting thought, she fell into a peaceful sleep, untroubled by nightmares for the first time since finding shelter in Ezra's cabin. Morning brought another clear day, warmer than the last. After breakfast, Ezra announced that the road to town would likely be passable by the following day. "We should prepare," he said. "If we leave at dawn, we can reach Pinecrest by mid-morning, conduct our business, and be back before dark." Abby nodded, already thinking about her disguise. "I'll need to alter some clothes. Do you have any of Sarah's things I could use, just for the trip?" she added quickly, seeing his expression. I wouldn't ask otherwise. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once sharply. Wait here. He disappeared down the hallway to the locked room. Abby heard the key turn in the lock, then silence. Several minutes passed before he emerged carrying a simple dress of deep blue wool and a worn shawl. These were hers, he said, his voice carefully neutral as he placed them on the table. They might need adjustment. Sarah was taller than you. Thank you, Abby said softly, understanding what the gesture cost him. I'll take good care of them. They're just things, Ezra said, though his tone belied the words. Sarah would have wanted them used. Abby spent the morning altering the dress to fit her smaller frame. The fabric was good quality, the stitching indicating it had been made by a skilled hand. As she worked, she felt a strange connection to the woman who had worn it before, a woman she had never met, but whose absence had shaped the man who saved her life. Ezra busied himself outside checking the horses and preparing the sled they would use if the roads were still too deep with snow for the wagon. He seemed to be giving her space, for which Abby was grateful. The emotional territory they had entered the previous day was new and uncertain for both of them. By midday, she had finished the alterations and tried on the dress. It fit well enough, though it hung a bit loose in the bodice. The color brought out the blue in her eyes, something she noticed with a flash of feminine vanity that surprised her. It had been a long time since she had cared about such things. When Ezra returned for the noon meal, he stopped short at the sight of her in Sarah's dress. I'm sorry, Abby said immediately, mistaking his expression for distress. I can change back. No, he said quickly. No, it's fine. It suits you. There was something in his gaze that made Abby's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, however, he turned away to wash his hands at the basin. They ate in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. Afterward, Ezra brought out Daniel's Bible again. I've been thinking about the evidence we have, he said. It's substantial but circumstantial. We need something more concrete if we're to accuse a judge of murder. What did you have in mind? Judge Blackwood keeps a study in his home where he stores his medications. If we could obtain a sample, Abby's eyes widened. You're suggesting we break into the judge's house? Not we, Ezra clarified. Me. You'll create a distraction while I slip in. The judge spends most mornings at the courthouse, but his wife is usually home. It's too dangerous, Abby protested. If you're caught. I won't be. Ezra's expression was determined. I've thought this through. Mrs. Blackwood never misses her weekly hair appointment at the milliner's shop. While she's there, I'll enter through the back door. The judge's study window faces the alley. I've observed it before. You've been planning this for some time, Abby realized. Ezra nodded. Since before you arrived. Your presence actually makes it more feasible. The distraction will ensure Mrs. Blackwood stays at the shop longer. What kind of distraction? Nothing complicated. You'll enter the shop after her disguised as a traveler passing through. Engage her in conversation, keep her there as long as possible. Abby considered the plan. It was risky, but if successful, it could provide the evidence they needed. All right, she agreed finally. But we need a signal in case something goes wrong. They spent the afternoon refining the details of their plan, accounting for various contingencies. By the time darkness fell, they had a strategy that seemed sound, though Abby couldn't quite shake her nervousness. As they prepared for bed, Ezra paused in stoking the fire. Abby, he said, his back to her, if anything happens to me tomorrow, there's a locked box under the floorboards beneath my bed. The key is on the chain with my pocket watch. Inside are letters, documents, everything I've gathered about the judge. Take it to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. The gravity of his words sent a chill through her. Nothing will happen to you, she said firmly, to either of us. He turned to face her, his expression solemn. "Promise me anyway." "I promise," she said, meeting his gaze, "but you must promise me something in return." "What's that?" "Promise you won't take unnecessary risks. Daniel died seeking justice. I couldn't bear it if—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Ezra crossed the room to stand before her. "I'll be careful," he said softly. "I have too much to live for now." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. For a moment, Abby thought he might reach for her, might bridge the final distance between them. Instead, he stepped back, the moment passing like a shadow across the sun. "We should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As Abby lay in bed that night, she found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of the dangerous task ahead, of the growing connection between her and Ezra, of Daniel's last warning, "Trust no one." But she did trust Ezra. Despite everything, his loss of faith, his years of isolation, his initial reluctance to involve her in his investigation, she trusted him completely. When had that happened? When had this stern, wounded man become someone whose presence brought her comfort rather than caution? Outside, an owl called into the night. Abby turned her face toward the window, watching the stars that Sarah had loved. Tomorrow, they would confront the man who had taken Daniel from her, who had destroyed Ezra's family and faith. Tomorrow, they would seek justice, whatever the cost. With that sobering thought, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The dream came again, Daniel standing at the foot of her bed, his face grave. "Be careful, Abby," he said. "The judge knows more than you think." But this time, there was something different. Daniel wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman Abby had never seen, but somehow recognized: Sarah Hartfield. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and golden hair that seemed to catch light even in the dimness of the dream. "Take care of him," Sarah said, her voice like distant music. "He's forgotten how to live." Abby tried to respond, to ask questions, but the figures were already fading, leaving only a lingering impression of urgency and something else, a blessing, perhaps. She woke to the sound of Ezra moving about the cabin, preparing for their journey. Dawn was just breaking, painting the snow outside with pale pink light. "You're awake," he observed, setting a cup of coffee on the small table beside the bed. "Good. We should leave within the hour." Abby sat up, the dream still vivid in her mind. "I saw them," she said. "Daniel and Sarah, together." Ezra went still. "A dream," he said, but his voice held a question. "Yes, but—" Abby took a sip of the coffee, gathering her thoughts. "It felt real. Sarah was beautiful. She had eyes like yours, kind, but with a hint of stubbornness." A ghost of a smile touched Ezra's lips. "That sounds like her. Stubborn to a fault." He hesitated. "What did they say in the dream?" "Daniel warned me about the judge. And Sarah—" Abby met Ezra's gaze. "Sarah asked me to take care of you. She said you've forgotten how to live." Something flickered in Ezra's eyes. Pain, certainly, but also a reluctant wonder. He turned away, busying himself with preparations, but Abby sensed her words had affected him deeply. They ate a quick breakfast, then dressed for the journey. Abby put on Sarah's altered dress and shawl, along with her own boots and a bonnet Ezra had found in a trunk. The bonnet's wide brim would help shield her face from casual observation. Ezra hitched 2 horses to the sled, the snow still being too deep for the wagon on some parts of the road. He helped Abby up, then climbed in beside her, taking the reins. "Ready?" he asked. Abby nodded, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Ready." With a click of his tongue, Ezra set the horses in motion. The sled glided smoothly over the packed snow, leaving the safety of the ranch behind. The journey to Pinecrest took just over 2 hours. They spoke little, each lost in thought about the task ahead. As they approached the outskirts of town, Ezra guided the horses into a stand of trees off the main road. "We'll leave the sled here," he said. "Less chance of it being recognized." They secured the horses and continued on foot. Ezra carried a rifle ostensibly for hunting, but actually for protection if needed. Abby kept her head down, the bonnet shadowing her face. Pinecrest came into view, a small frontier town, consisting of one main street with various businesses, the courthouse at one end and the church at the other. Side streets held residences, including the imposing home of Judge Blackwood on the eastern edge of town. "Remember the plan," Ezra murmured as they reached the first buildings. "Mrs. Blackwood should be at the milliner's by now. I'll make my way to their house while you keep her occupied." "Be careful," Abby whispered. "Always." His hand brushed hers briefly, a reassuring touch. "We meet back at the sled in 2 hours, no matter what." They parted ways, Ezra heading down a side street, while Abby continued toward the town center. She kept her gaze down, heart pounding at the risk of being recognized. But the few people she passed paid her little attention, assuming she was just another traveler. The milliner's shop was near the center of town, a small but elegant establishment that catered to Pinecrest's wealthier ladies. Through the window, Abby could see Mrs. Blackwood seated at a small table being attended to by the milliner, Mrs. Collins. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Abby pushed open the door. A small bell announced her arrival. Both women looked up. Mrs. Blackwood, a thin woman in her 50s with carefully arranged gray hair, regarded Abby with the automatic assessment of one accustomed to judging others by their appearance. Mrs. Collins, plump and pleasant, smiled welcomingly. "Good morning," the milliner said. "I'll be with you in just a moment. I'm finishing with Mrs. Blackwood." "No hurry," Abby replied, disguising her voice with a slight Eastern accent. "I'm just passing through town and thought I might find a new bonnet. This one has seen better days." She touched the brim of her borrowed headwear. Mrs. Blackwood's interest visibly sharpened. News from outside Pinecrest was always welcome currency in her social circles. "Passing through from where, if I may ask?" "Boston originally," Abby replied, having prepared this story carefully. "But most recently from Helena. I'm joining my brother in Oregon. Traveling alone. How unusual. Widows have few options. Mrs. Blackwood? Martha Blackwood." The older woman gestured to a chair. "Please join us while you wait." "Helena, you say my husband, the judge, corresponds with several officials there." Abby took the offered seat, relieved that her disguise seemed to be working. "How interesting. I met the governor briefly at a function. A most impressive man." This was the distraction Ezra had hoped for. Mrs. Blackwood would not pass up an opportunity to gather gossip about important figures that might elevate her own status by association. As the milliner finished arranging Mrs. Blackwood's hair, Abby kept the conversation flowing, inventing tasteful anecdotes about Helena's society that flattered the older woman's sense of importance without being obviously false. "And what brings you to our little Pinecrest?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. "We're hardly on the main route to Oregon." "The stage driver mentioned a shorter route through these mountains," Abby improvised, "though with the recent snow I'm beginning to think the longer way might have been wiser." "Oh, you must stay at least overnight," Mrs. Blackwood said, warming to her role as town hostess. "The roads west are likely still impassable. We have a small hotel that's quite adequate for a lady traveling alone." "That's very kind," Abby said, calculating how much time had passed. Ezra would need at least another 30 minutes. "Perhaps I will. I admit the journey has been tiring." Mrs. Collins finished her work and presented a small mirror for Mrs. Blackwood's approval. Perfect as always, Mrs. Collins, the judge's wife declared. Now, let's find something suitable for our visitor. Something more fashionable than that dreadful bonnet. For the next half hour, Abby was subjected to a parade of hats and bonnets, with Mrs. Blackwood offering increasingly pointed opinions about each. Eventually, to maintain the charade, Abby selected a modest bonnet with a blue ribbon that matched Sarah's dress. As she paid for her purchase, a commotion outside drew their attention. A young boy burst into the shop, his face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Blackwood, your house, there's smoke coming from the judge's study." The older woman paled. "What? That's impossible. The judge is at the courthouse. The neighbors saw it and sent me to find you," the boy insisted. "They're gathering men to help now." Mrs. Blackwood gathered her things hastily. "I must go at once. Mrs. Collins put everything on my account. Good day, Mrs. Oh, I didn't catch your name." "Palmer," Abby supplied smoothly. "Elizabeth Palmer. I do hope it's nothing serious." But Mrs. Blackwood was already rushing out the door, the boy at her heels. Abby's heart raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Had something gone wrong? Was Ezra in danger? She thanked Mrs. Collins and left the shop, deliberately walking in the opposite direction from the Blackwood residence. Once out of sight, however, she cut through an alley, making her way toward the judge's house as quickly as she dared. A small crowd had gathered on the street outside the imposing two-story home. Abby hung back, scanning the faces for Ezra, but not seeing him. Smoke was indeed visible curling from a window on the ground floor. "Just the curtains from what I hear," a man nearby was saying. "Caught fire from a lamp left too close. They've put it out already." Relief flooded through Abby. A diversion, she realized. Ezra had created a distraction of his own to ensure he could escape undetected. She turned away, making her way back toward the edge of town where they had left the sled. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice how strange it felt to be back in Pinecrest, a place that had been her home for years, but now felt alien and threatening. Passing the church, Abby paused. The small white building had been a source of comfort after Daniel's death. On impulse, she climbed the steps and slipped inside. The interior was cool and quiet, sunlight filtering through simple stained glass windows. Abby moved to a pew near the back and sat bowing her head in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "guide us. Protect Ezra. Help us find justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves." "Amen," a voice said behind her. Abby turned, startled. A young man in clerical garb stood in the aisle. Reverend Matthews, who had taken over the congregation after Ezra left. He was perhaps 30, with earnest eyes and a friendly smile. "I didn't mean to interrupt your prayers," he said. "We don't often get visitors this time of year." "Just passing through," Abby said, keeping her head slightly bowed so the bonnet shaded her face. The church looked peaceful. "It is that." The Reverend sat in the pew across the aisle. "Though I sometimes think it misses its former shepherd. Reverend Hartfield built quite a connection with this congregation before his departure." Abby's interest sharpened. "You knew him?" "Not well. I arrived after he left, but people still speak of him often." The young pastor hesitated. Some with anger, some with understanding. He suffered a terrible loss. "His wife," Abby said softly. Reverend Matthews nodded, "and his child. It broke something in him, his faith, his connection to the community. The elders tried to help, but—" He shrugged sadly. "Sometimes grief takes a man places others cannot follow." Or perhaps, Abby suggested, others weren't willing to follow where his grief led him. The Reverend looked at her with new interest. "An insightful observation. You speak as one who has known loss yourself. Haven't we all, in one way or another?" He conceded the point with a nod. Indeed. Is there something specific you came to pray for today? Justice, Abby said simply. And healing. Worthy prayers both. Reverend Matthews rose. I'll leave you to them. God's peace be with you, sister. After he left, Abby remained in the pew, thinking about what he had said. The community had tried to help Ezra, yet had ultimately let him retreat into isolation. Had they tried hard enough? Or had they been relieved when the grief-stricken pastor removed himself, taking his uncomfortable questions and his crisis of faith with him? When enough time had passed, Abby left the church and made her way to the edge of town. She kept to side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where she might be recognized. As she neared the stand of trees where they had left the sled, anxiety gnawed at her. What if Ezra hadn't made it out? What if he had been caught? But as she approached, she saw him waiting with the horses, his tall figure a welcome sight. Relief washed over her. "You're safe," she said, hurrying to join him. "As are you." His eyes scanned her face. "No trouble." "None. Mrs. Blackwood didn't recognize me, but the fire, a necessary improvisation." Ezra helped her onto the sled. "I needed more time than expected. Did you find what we were looking for?" He patted his coat pocket. "And more, but we should discuss it away from town." With a click to the horses, they set off, leaving Pinecrest behind. Abby glanced back once at the town that had been her home, wondering if she would ever return, and if so, under what circumstances. They traveled in silence until they were well away from town. Finally, Ezra guided the horses off the main road into a small clearing. "We need to talk," he said, securing the reins. "What I found in the judge's study, it's worse than we thought." From his pocket, he withdrew a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. This was in a locked cabinet, along with these. He produced a folded paper containing several dried leaves and what looked like crushed roots. "Do you recognize them?" Abby examined the plant material carefully. "Some of it. This is foxglove. Daniel used it in very small doses for certain heart conditions. And this?" She held up a dark, twisted root. "I believe it's water hemlock, highly poisonous. Daniel would never have prescribed it." The judge had dozens of vials and packets like these, some labeled with names. Ezra's expression was grim. "Including Sarah's, and your husband's." Abby's blood ran cold. "He kept evidence of his crimes. He kept trophies," Ezra corrected, "and records. I found a ledger with dates, names, and treatments administered. Sarah's name was there. So was Daniel's, along with the notation, 'Suspicious requires handling.'" "My God," Abby whispered. "He's been poisoning people systematically. But why? What does he gain? Power, money." Ezra produced another document. "I found this a map of land holdings in the county. Properties marked in red belong to people who died unexpectedly in the past 5 years. Properties marked in blue now belong to either the judge or his business associates." Abby studied the map, horror growing as she understood the pattern. He's been eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his land acquisitions, building his empire one death at a time, and using his position to ensure no questions were asked. Ezra's jaw clenched. No questions, except from one persistent doctor who noticed something wasn't right. They sat in silence for a moment, the full weight of their discovery settling over them. "What do we do now?" Abby asked finally. "We can't go to the sheriff. He's appointed by the judge." "No," Ezra agreed. "We need to take this higher to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. But first we need to secure this evidence somewhere safe. The judge doesn't know what I took, but he'll notice the break-in. He'll be suspicious. We should return to the ranch, then leave for Helena as soon as possible." Ezra nodded, taking up the reins again. "Tomorrow at first light." As they continued their journey back to the ranch, Abby thought about what they had discovered. The judge's crimes were more extensive and calculated than either of them had imagined. The man had been systematically eliminating obstacles to his ambition for years, hiding behind his respectable position while he built a small empire on the graves of his victims. Daniel had suspected something had begun to piece it together, and for that, he had been silenced. The realization hardened Abby's resolve. They would bring the judge to justice, whatever it took. Beside her, Ezra was silent, his expression unreadable, but she could sense the storm of emotions beneath his controlled exterior. Anger, vindication, perhaps even a measure of peace at finally confirming what he had long suspected about Sarah's death. "Ezra," she said softly, "when this is over, what then?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Perhaps it's time you did." Abby chose her words carefully. "Sarah would want you to have a future, not just vengeance." "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you want when this is over?" The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For 2 years she had existed in a kind of limbo, neither fully living nor ready to let go of the past. But these days, with Ezra, this shared purpose had awakened something in her, a desire for more than mere existence. "I want to live again," she said honestly, "to find purpose, to perhaps not be alone." Their eyes met, and in that moment understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed, unexpected but undeniable. Then Ezra looked away, focusing on the road ahead. "First we survive this," he said. "Then we can think about the future." It wasn't a rejection, Abby realized, but a necessary prioritization. And he had said, "We, not I," a small but significant choice of words. As they approached the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the snow. They had accomplished their mission and returned safely, but Abby couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. They had uncovered a dangerous truth, and the judge was a powerful man with much to lose. The next 24 hours would determine whether they would succeed in bringing him to justice or join the growing list of those who had been silenced for getting too close to the truth. They reached the ranch as dusk was falling, the sky painted in shades of purple and deep blue. Ezra helped Abby down from the sled, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "You should rest," he said. "I'll tend to the horses and bring in more firewood for the night." Abby nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The tension of the day, the constant fear of discovery had drained her more than she'd realized. Inside the cabin, she stoked the fire and began preparing a simple meal from their provisions. The familiar tasks helped calm her racing thoughts, grounding her in the present moment. When Ezra returned, they ate in companionable silence, both processing the day's discoveries. After the meal, he spread the evidence they had gathered on the table. The vial of poison, the ledger, the map, along with Daniel's Bible and its coded notations. "We need to organize this," Ezra said. "Present it clearly for the marshal." They worked side by side, piecing together the story of the judge's crimes in a way that would be compelling and irrefutable. Daniel's medical notes provided the scientific foundation, explaining how certain symptoms had been misdiagnosed or attributed to natural causes when they were in fact evidence of poisoning. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed, sending a current of awareness through Abby each time. She found herself hyper-conscious of Ezra's proximity, the clean scent of him, the warmth that radiated from his tall frame, the way the firelight caught in his hair and beard. When they had finished, Ezra gathered the documents into a leather portfolio. "I'll pack this with our things for tomorrow," he said. "We should leave before dawn." Abby nodded, suppressing a yawn. The events of the day were catching up with her. "Get some rest," Ezra said gently. I'll bank the fire and join you shortly. She retired to the bed, but sleep eluded her despite her fatigue. Her mind kept returning to what they had discovered, to the danger they still faced, and to the uncertain future beyond. When Ezra finally settled on his pallet by the fire, Abby spoke into the darkness. Ezra, are you awake? Yes, came his quiet reply. I'm afraid, she admitted, not of what might happen to me, but of failing, of the judge escaping justice. She heard him shift, turning toward her voice. We won't fail, Abby. We have the evidence. We'll see this through. And if something happens to us before we reach Helena, Ezra was silent for a long moment. I've considered that possibility, he said finally. There's a Blackfoot camp a day's ride north of here. Greyhawk knows what we suspect about the judge. If we don't return within 3 days, he'll take copies of our evidence to the authorities. The revelation eased some of Abby's anxiety. You've thought of everything. Not everything, Ezra said, his voice softer now. I never expected to find someone who understood, someone who shared this burden with me. The vulnerability in his words made Abby's heart ache. Nor did I, she whispered. Silence fell between them, filled with unspoken feelings and the crackling of the fire. Eventually, Abby's exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts, and she drifted into sleep. Her last conscious thought was a prayer not for justice or protection, but for the wounded man sleeping across the room whose heart was slowly awakening from a long frozen grief. Abby woke suddenly, unsure what had disturbed her sleep. The cabin was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Outside, the wind had picked up moaning around the eaves. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The soft crunch of snow beneath boots coming from outside the cabin. She sat up, her heart pounding. Ezra, she whispered urgently. He was already awake, moving silently to retrieve his rifle. He put a finger to his lips, then gestured for her to stay down. Another sound, a faint scraping at the door. Not the wind. Someone was trying to enter. Ezra positioned himself beside the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. His body tensed, and he motioned for Abby to move toward the back of the cabin. The door burst open with a splintering crack. 2 men rushed in, pistols drawn. Behind them, illuminated in the doorway, stood Judge Garrett Blackwood. Good evening, Reverend Hartfield, the judge said, his cultured voice at odds with the violence of the entry. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Retry OK. Next part, 7,002 edit prayers in the blizzard. Part 3. Judge Blackwood stepped into the cabin, removing his gloves with deliberate calm. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the well-fed look of prosperity. His expensive coat and polished boots seemed out of place in the rustic cabin, but his cold eyes belonged perfectly to the moment calculating merciless. Lower your weapon, Reverend, he said, gesturing to Ezra's rifle. My men won't hesitate to shoot if necessary. Ezra held the judge's gaze, rifle still raised. How did you find us? A neighbor saw your sled near town, recognized the markings. Blackwood smiled thinly. Small communities have long memories, especially for those who abandon their calling. One of the men, a rough-looking fellow with a jagged scar across his cheek, moved toward Abby. This, the seamstress, everyone thought died in the storm, not looking so dead to me. Indeed. The judge's gaze shifted to Abby, who had wrapped a quilt around herself over her nightdress. Mrs. Winters, what a miraculous recovery. And in the company of our former pastor, no less. How providential. What do you want, Blackwood? Ezra demanded, drawing the judge's attention back to himself. You know exactly what I want. The items you stole from my study. Blackwood's pleasant facade slipped, revealing the steel beneath. Return them now, and perhaps we can resolve this misunderstanding without bloodshed. Abby saw Ezra's finger tighten slightly on the trigger. The tension in the room was suffocating three armed men against one, with her caught in the middle. Ezra, she said softly. Don't. His eyes flickered to her briefly, then back to the judge. With visible reluctance, he lowered the rifle. Wise choice, Blackwood said. Now the items you took. In my saddlebag, Ezra replied. By the door. The judge nodded to the second man who retrieved the leather bag and brought it to his employer. Blackwood opened it, examining the contents, the vial of poison, the ledger, the map with its damning markings. All seems to be here, he murmured, then looked up sharply. And the copies you've undoubtedly made, there are no copies, Ezra said, his voice steady despite the lie. Blackwood studied him for a moment, then chuckled. You always were a poor liar, Reverend, one of your many weaknesses as a pastor. He turned to his men. Search the cabin. Thoroughly. The two men began tearing through the small space, upending furniture, emptying drawers, slashing the mattress with knives. Abby watched in horror as they destroyed the humble home Ezra had built. You won't find anything, Ezra insisted. We haven't had time to make copies. Better to be certain. Blackwood seated himself in Ezra's chair by the fire, making himself comfortable, while his men continued their destruction. You know, Reverend, I always respected your intelligence. That's why I'm surprised you've pursued this vendetta for so long. It's not a vendetta when you're seeking justice for murder, Ezra replied coldly. Murder. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, a strong accusation especially from a man who has abandoned his faith. Without faith, what basis do you have for morality, for judging right from wrong? I don't need faith to know that poisoning innocent people is wrong. The judge sighed, as if disappointed by a child's poor reasoning. The affairs of men who build communities, who create civilization from wilderness, these are complex matters. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good. Sarah was pregnant. Ezra said, his voice rough with emotion. What possible greater good justified killing her and our unborn child? Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes, not remorse, but perhaps annoyance at being questioned. Your wife owned land that was critical to a development project that will eventually bring the railroad to Pinecrest. She refused to sell. After your unfortunate tragedy, the property passed to you, and you, in your grief, were much more amenable to the offer. The cold calculation of it stunned Abby. She looked at Ezra and saw the shock and rage battling for control of his features. And Daniel, she demanded, unable to stay silent. What was his crime? Blackwood turned his attention to her. Dr. Winters was becoming problematic, asking questions about treatments, examining my prescriptions too closely. A pity he was an excellent physician otherwise. He was a good man, Abby said, her voice shaking with anger. A healer. He helped people. And now he's a dead man, Blackwood replied dismissively, as the two of you will soon be unless we reach an understanding. One of the men approached the judge. Nothing, sir. No copies that we can find. Blackwood nodded unsurprised. Well, then, we move to the next phase. He stood retrieving his gloves. Reverend Heartfield, Mrs. Winters, you have a choice. Sign statements confessing to an illicit affair, forswear any accusations against me, and leave Montana Territory forever, or refuse and join the unfortunate list of tragic accidents that occur in these harsh mountains. Abby felt cold dread settle in her stomach. The judge was offering them their lives in exchange for silence and exile. "And if we agree," Ezra asked, "what guarantee do we have that you'll keep your word?" "Only my reputation as a man of law," Blackwood said with a thin smile. "But consider the alternative carefully. No one would question if the disgraced former pastor and the widow rumored to be of loose morals met with misfortune, especially after your cabin mysteriously catches fire." The threat hung in the air, explicit and terrifying. Abby looked at Ezra, trying to read his thoughts. His face was impassive, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. "We'll need time to consider," he said finally. "You have until dawn," the judge replied. "My men will remain to ensure you don't attempt anything unwise." He moved toward the door. "I'll return at first light for your decision." After the judge left, the two hired men made themselves comfortable, one taking Ezra's chair, the other leaning against the wall near the door gun casually displayed. "Make yourselves at home," the scarred man said with a cruel grin. "But don't try nothin'. Judge said to keep you alive till morning, but he didn't say in what condition." Ezra moved to Abby's side, speaking quietly. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though in truth she was terrified. "What are we going to do?" "For now, nothing," he murmured. "Wait and watch for an opportunity." They sat together on the edge of the bed, the only piece of furniture not completely destroyed in the search. The night stretched endlessly before them, each minute tense with danger, and the knowledge that dawn might bring their deaths. Abby found herself studying the two men who held them captive. The scarred one was clearly the leader, older, harder, with eyes that had seen too much violence. The younger one seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with his gun and avoiding looking directly at them. A potential weakness, she thought. If they could somehow exploit the younger man's reluctance. Hours passed. The scarred man dozed in the chair while his companion maintained a nervous watch. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows with increasing force. "Storm's coming back," the younger guard muttered. "Bad timing." His companion grunted without opening his eyes. "Shut up, Ritter. Keep your mind on the job." Abby felt Ezra stiffen beside her. "Ritter," he repeated, studying the younger man with new interest. "Not Jacob Ritter." The guard looked startled. "How'd you know my name?" "I knew your mother," Ezra said. "Ruth Ritter. She attended my church, prayed for you every Sunday." The young man's face paled. "You're lying. My ma's been dead 10 years. 8 years, Ezra corrected gently. "Consumption took her in the winter of '65. I conducted her funeral. She left you her Bible with a letter inside a letter, asking you to find your way back to the path of righteousness." Jacob Ritter stared at Ezra, shock evident in his young face. "How could you know that because she showed me the letter before she sealed it? She loved you, Jacob, despite the trouble you'd been in. Her last words were prayers for your soul." The scarred man opened his eyes, scowling. "Enough of this preacher talk. Shut your mouth, Hartfield." But the damage was done. Doubt had crept into Ritter's expression, a chink in his loyalty to the judge. "The man you're working for is a murderer," Ezra continued, ignoring the warning. "He killed my wife and unborn child. He killed Mrs. Winters's husband. How many more innocent people will die to feed his greed?" "I said, shut up!" The scarred man stood, raising his gun threateningly. At that moment, the cabin door burst open, sending a blast of frigid air and snow swirling into the room. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, rifle raised. "Drop your weapons," commanded a deep voice. "Now!" The scarred man whirled, firing wildly at the door. The shot went wide. The answering shot didn't. The guard crumpled to the floor, blood blossoming on his chest. Ritter stood frozen, his gun, half raised, clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. "Don't," Ezra warned him. "Put it down, son." After a moment's hesitation, Ritter lowered his weapon. The figure in the doorway stepped into the light, revealing a weathered face framed by long gray hair. It was an elderly Native American man, his dark eyes sharp with intelligence. "Greyhawk," Ezra said, relief evident in his voice, "your timing is impeccable." The Blackfoot medicine man nodded once. "The spirits told me you were in danger. I see they spoke true." He entered, fully followed by two younger Blackfoot warriors. While they secured Ritter Greyhawk, approached Ezra and Abby. "The white judge has returned," he said. "His evil grows bolder." "Yes," Ezra confirmed. "He came for the evidence we gathered. He'll be back at dawn for our answer: life in exile or death." Greyhawk's expression remained impassive, but his eyes flashed with anger. "This judge has poisoned many, including our people. The time for justice has come." He turned to one of the warriors. "Ride to the camp. Bring 10 men. We leave for Helena before first light." "Helena?" Abby questioned. "But the judge will be here at dawn." "Which is why you will not be," Greyhawk replied. "You will take the evidence to the territorial authorities while we delay the judge." "It's too dangerous," Ezra protested. "Blackwood won't come alone. Neither will we." The old man's confidence was unwavering. "The judge believes himself above all law, white man's and nature's alike. Today he learns differently." While they spoke, the Blackfoot warriors had bound Ritter securely. The young man looked terrified, but resigned to his fate. "What about him?" Ezra asked, nodding toward their captive. Greyhawk considered Ritter thoughtfully. "He is young, misguided. The spirits say his heart is not yet lost." He addressed the trembling guard directly. "You will have a choice, young one. Help us bring justice to the man who has corrupted you, or face the consequences alongside him." Ritter's gaze darted to the fallen body of his companion, then back to Greyhawk. I didn't know about the killings, I swear. The judge just hired me to protect him, said some folks were trying to ruin his reputation with lies." "And now that you know they weren't lies?" Ezra asked. The young man swallowed hard. "My ma would want me to do right," he said finally. "I'll help you. The judge is planning to bring 6 men at dawn, all armed." Greyhawk nodded, satisfied. "Good. You begin to walk a better path." He turned to Ezra and Abby. "You must prepare quickly. Take only what you need. The storm will cover your tracks, but it will also slow your journey." As they gathered their belongings, Abby found herself overcome with gratitude for the old medicine man's timely arrival. "How did you know to come tonight?" she asked. Greyhawk's weathered face softened slightly. "I have watched over Ezra since his wife returned to the spirit world. Tonight, the ancestors sent a warning, a vision of darkness descending on this cabin." He glanced at Ezra. "Sarah's spirit is restless. She will not find peace until justice is done." The mention of Sarah sent a pang through Abby's heart. She recalled her dream, Sarah and Daniel together offering warnings and blessings. Had it been more than just a dream, within the hour they were ready to depart. The storm had intensified, providing cover, but making travel treacherous. Greyhawk provided them with snowshoes and heavy fur cloaks from his people. "Take the eastern trail," he instructed Ezra. "It is longer but safer from pursuit. One of my men will guide you to the territorial road." Ezra clasped the old man's hand. "I can never repay this debt." "There is no debt between friends," Greyhawk replied. "But if you wish to honor our friendship, remember the faith you have set aside. The Great Spirit has not abandoned you even when you turned from him." The words seemed to strike Ezra deeply. He nodded, unable to respond. Before they left, Abby approached Ritter, who sat under guard, his hands bound, but his expression clearer than before. "Your mother would be proud of your choice tonight," she said softly. The young man looked up at her eyes, glistening with unshed tears. "The Reverend, he really knew her. Ezra doesn't lie," Abby assured him. "Even when he lost his faith, he never lost his honor." As they prepared to step out into the storm, Ezra took Abby's hand. "Stay close," he said. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The conviction in his voice warmed her despite the howling wind that greeted them. Together, they stepped into the swirling snow, leaving behind the cabin that had sheltered them and the lives they had known. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope of justice. But they would face it side by side, their hearts aligned in purpose and in something deeper that neither dared yet name. The journey to Helena was arduous. The resurgent storm slowed their progress, forcing them to seek shelter frequently. What should have been a 2-day ride stretched to 3, then 4. Their Blackfoot guide, a stoic young warrior named Running Wolf, led them through hidden valleys and mountain passes, avoiding the main roads where the judge's men might be searching. Each night, they made camp in whatever shelter they could find: caves, abandoned hunting cabins, once even a hollowed-out fallen sequoia. During those cold nights huddled close for warmth, Abby and Ezra spoke of many things. The barriers between them fell away as they shared memories of their lost spouses, hopes for the future, and fears about what awaited them in Helena. "What if they don't believe us?" Abby asked on the third night, as they sat beside a small fire in a rocky overhang. "The judge is respected, powerful. We're a disgraced pastor and a seamstress accused of immoral behavior. The evidence speaks for itself," Ezra replied, though doubt tinged his voice. "And we have Ritter's testimony now, if Greyhawk convinces him to come forward. Do you think they succeeded in delaying the judge?" Ezra stared into the flames. "Greyhawk is wise and resourceful. If anyone could manage it, he could." He paused. "I should have had more faith in him. In many things." Abby studied his profile in the firelight. "You're changing, Ezra. I can see it." He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "The bitterness is fading," she explained. "You're finding your way back to something." "To faith, you mean?" He shook his head. "I don't know if I can ever reclaim what I lost." "Perhaps you're not meant to reclaim it. Perhaps you're meant to build something new, a faith tempered by suffering, stronger for having been broken and reforged." Ezra was silent for a long moment. "When did you become so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Abby said softly. "Daniel used to say that healing isn't about returning to what was before, but about finding a new wholeness that incorporates the wound." "He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was." Abby looked up at Ezra. "As are you in a different way." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability. His hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining. "Abby," he began, his voice low and uncertain. But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by Running Wolf, returning from scouting. "Storm clearing," the warrior announced. "We continue at first light." The moment passed, but the connection remained a tangible thing between them as they settled down to sleep. On the morning of the 5th day, they crested a hill and saw Helena spread before them, a bustling territorial capital nestled between mountains. The sight brought both relief and trepidation. Their journey was ending, but the real challenge was about to begin. Running Wolf led them to the edge of town. "This is where I leave you," he said. "Greyhawk says to seek the marshal named Howard. He is a man of honor." Ezra clasped the young warrior's arm in gratitude. "Thank your people for us. We owe them our lives." Running Wolf nodded once, then disappeared back into the wilderness with the silent grace of his people. Abby and Ezra made their way into town, aware of the curious glances their travel-worn appearance attracted. After days in the wilderness, they must have looked a sight exhausted, dirty determined. The marshal's office was a solid brick building on the main street. Marshal James Howard, they discovered, was a grizzled veteran of the Civil War with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Let me get this straight," he said after hearing their story. "You're accusing Judge Garrett Blackwood, one of the most respected jurists in the territory, of multiple murders by poison over a period of years." "Yes, sir," Ezra confirmed. "We have evidence." He produced the portfolio containing Daniel's coded notes, the map showing the pattern of deaths and property transfers, and most damning, the small vial of poison they had managed to hide from the judge's men. Marshal Howard examined each item carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "This is circumstantial at best," he said finally. "The word of a former pastor who abandoned his congregation and a seamstress run out of town against a sitting judge. Not much of a case." Abby felt despair rising within her. "Marshal, my husband, documented the judge's crimes meticulously. He died for that knowledge. Please, you must see the pattern here." The marshal tapped the map thoughtfully. "I see something all right, but seeing ain't the same as proving in a court of law." He leaned back in his chair. "However, I've had my suspicions about Blackwood for some time. Reports of irregularities in land transactions, rumors of intimidation, nothing I could act on officially." Hope flickered in Abby's heart. "Then you believe us? Let's say I'm willing to investigate." Howard stood pacing behind his desk. "But I can't simply ride into Pinecrest and arrest a judge based on your say-so. I need more, preferably a witness willing to testify." "There may be one," Ezra said. "A young man named Jacob Ritter, who worked for the judge. He was with Blackwood when he came to my cabin." The marshal raised an eyebrow. "And where is this Ritter now?" "With Greyhawk and the Blackfoot, if they succeeded in their plan to delay the judge." Howard's expression darkened. "Indians interfering with a territorial judge, that complicates matters significantly." "They were protecting us," Abby protested. "The judge intended to kill us." "Maybe so, ma'am, but the law doesn't look kindly on natives taking matters into their own hands, or even with good intentions." The marshal sighed. "I'll need to consult with the territorial governor. In the meantime, you two should find lodgings and keep a low profile. Blackwood has friends in Helena." As they left the marshal's office, Abby felt a mixture of relief and frustration. They had been heard, but not fully believed. The wheels of justice were turning, but slowly, perhaps too slowly. Ezra seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's a beginning," he said, guiding her toward a modest hotel. "More than we had before. But what if the judge reaches Helena before the marshal acts? What if Greyhawk and his people face retaliation? We have to trust the process, Abby. And pray." The word seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "Yes, pray," he repeated more firmly. "For the first time in years, I feel as though my prayers might be heard." The simple admission touched Abby deeply. Ezra was indeed finding his way back to faith step by painful step. They secured a room at the hotel, 2 rooms, technically, though Ezra insisted on sleeping in a chair in Abby's room to ensure her safety. The first proper beds they had seen in days were a luxury neither took for granted. After washing away the grime of their journey and changing into clean clothes purchased at a nearby store, they ventured down to the hotel's dining room for a hot meal. They were halfway through their supper when the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and 2 men in expensive coats. Abby felt Ezra tense beside her. "Blackwood's associates," he murmured. "The tall one is Edward Sterling, his business partner. The other is Theodore Chambers, a lawyer who handles his affairs." Abby kept her head down, grateful for the modest bonnet that partially concealed her face. "Do you think they're looking for us?" "Possibly. The judge would have sent word ahead once he realized we'd fled." The men took a table across the room, seemingly unaware of Ezra and Abby's presence. Their conversation was too low to overhear, but their serious expressions suggested business of some importance. "We should leave," Abby whispered. Ezra shook his head slightly. "That would draw attention. Finish your meal naturally, then we'll retire to our rooms." They managed to complete their dinner without incident, though Abby's appetite had vanished. As they rose to leave, however, Sterling looked up, his gaze catching on Ezra. Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Hartfield," he called. "Ezra Hartfield, is that you?" Ezra stiffened, but maintained his composure. "Sterling," he acknowledged with a nod. "It's been some time." Sterling approached, studying Ezra with undisguised curiosity. "Indeed it has. Not since you left the church, as I recall. What brings you to Helena?" "Personal business," Ezra replied vaguely. "And you?" "The same, more or less." Sterling's gaze shifted to Abby, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure, madam." "Mrs. Palmer," Abby supplied, using the alias she had given in Pinecrest. "Elizabeth Palmer." "Mrs. Palmer is a friend from back east," Ezra added smoothly, "passing through on her way to Oregon." Sterling nodded, though suspicion lingered in his expression. "Well, don't let me keep you. Perhaps we'll see more of each other during your stay." "Perhaps," Ezra agreed noncommittally. "Good evening, gentlemen." As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Abby whispered, "He recognized me, didn't he?" "I'm not sure," Ezra replied, "but he certainly found our presence unexpected. We'll need to be more careful." In the safety of their room, Ezra paced restlessly. "Sterling will almost certainly send word to Blackwood. We need to press the marshal to act quickly." "And if he won't," Ezra stopped pacing, his expression resolute. "Then we find another way. I didn't come this far to fail now." The determination in his voice reassured Abby, but she couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. They were far from home, surrounded by potential enemies, with only their evidence and their word against one of the most powerful men in the territory. Yet, as she prepared for bed that night, watching Ezra settle uncomfortably into the room's single chair, she felt a strange peace. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and somehow that knowledge was enough to allow her to sleep. Abby woke to urgent knocking at the door. Beside her, Ezra was already on his feet, rifle in hand. "Who is it?" he called. "Marshal Howard," came the reply. "Open up, Hartfield. We need to talk." Ezra glanced at Abby, who nodded her assent. He unbolted the door, admitting the marshal and 2 deputies. "Get dressed quickly," Howard ordered without preamble. "Both of you. Blackwood has arrived in Helena, and he's brought serious accusations against you." Abby's heart sank. "What kind of accusations?" "Theft, breaking and entering, and—" The marshal looked uncomfortable. "Improper relations. He's convinced a judge to issue arrest warrants for both of you." "On what evidence?" Ezra demanded. "Sworn statements from witnesses who claim to have seen Mrs. Winters entering your cabin before the storm, testimony from townspeople about her reputation and your own history of unorthodox behavior since leaving the church. Howard's expression was grim. It's flimsy, but it's legal. The warrants have been issued. So, you're here to arrest us, Abby said flatly. The marshal surprised her with a shake of his head. No, ma'am. I'm here to get you out of Helena before Blackwood's men find you. I've been looking into your claims, and while I can't prove anything yet, I've found enough inconsistencies in the judge's land dealings to make me believe you might be onto something. Hope surged through Abby. Where will we go? I have a cabin outside town. You'll be safe there while I continue investigating. Howard gestured impatiently. But we need to move now. Sterling and Chambers were seen entering the courthouse this morning with Blackwood. They dressed hastily, gathering their few possessions. The marshal led them down a back staircase and through the kitchen to a waiting wagon covered with canvas. Stay low and quiet, he instructed as they climbed in among crates of supplies. We'll be passing checkpoints on the way out of town. The journey was tense, the wagon stopping several times for inspection. Each time the marshal exchanged casual greetings with the guards, explaining he was taking supplies to an outlying settlement. Each time Abby held her breath, expecting discovery. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the wagon turned onto a rough track leading into the foothills. When they stopped, the marshal pulled back the canvas. "We're clear," he said. "My cabin's just ahead." The structure was small, but solid, built in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. Inside was simple but comfortable a stone fireplace. Sturdy furniture provisions stocked in a pantry. "You'll be safe here," Howard assured them. "No one knows about this place, except my most trusted deputies." "How long will we need to stay?" Ezra asked. "Until I can build a case strong enough to arrest Blackwood." The marshal ran a hand through his graying hair. "I won't lie to you, it won't be easy. The judge has powerful friends, including the territorial governor." "What about our evidence?" Abby asked. "I have it secured. And there's something else you should know." Howard's expression softened slightly. "A rider came in from Pinecrest yesterday, a young man named Ritter. Says he wants to testify against Blackwood." Ezra's face lit with hope. "Jacob made it. Is he safe?" "He's in protective custody. His testimony corroborates parts of your story, including the judge's threat to kill you both." "And Greyhawk?" Abby asked anxiously. "The Blackfoot." Howard's expression turned grave. "That's the bad news. Blackwood is claiming they attacked him and his men without provocation. He's calling for military action against the tribe." "That's a lie," Abby exclaimed. "They were protecting us from murder." "I believe you, ma'am, but it's your word against a judge's, and in this territory." He left the implication hanging. Ezra's jaw tightened. "We need to resolve this quickly before innocent people suffer for helping us." "I'm doing what I can." The marshal moved toward the door. "I'll send word when I have news. In the meantime, stay here. There are supplies for at least 2 weeks, and a rifle with ammunition if you need to hunt." After he left, Abby sank onto a chair, overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. "Will it never end?" she whispered. "How many more people will be hurt because of Blackwood's evil?" Ezra knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "We will end this, Abby. One way or another." She looked into his eyes, drawing strength from his certainty. "I believe you," she said softly. He reached up gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The tender gesture made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might finally give voice to the feelings growing between them. Instead, he stood moving to check the cabin's defenses. "We should prepare for a longer stay than the marshal anticipates," he said. "Blackwood won't give up easily." Abby nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of disappointment. There would be time for personal matters once justice was secured if they survived to see it. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Abby and Ezra settled into a routine in the small cabin, taking turns with chores and keeping watch. They spoke often of the evidence against Blackwood, refining their understanding of his crimes, but rarely of the future or of the growing tension between them. On the fourth day, a snowstorm descended, isolating them completely. Huddled by the fire that night with wind howling outside, Abby finally broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "Ezra," she began hesitantly, "when this is over, what happens then?" He looked up from the book he'd been reading, one of several the marshal had left in the cabin. "What do you mean?" "I mean us. This." She gestured between them. "Whatever this is becoming." Ezra set the book aside, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I didn't expect any of this." "Nor did I." Abby looked down at her hands. "2 years ago, when I lost Daniel, I thought my life was over. I existed, but I wasn't living. And then the storm came, and you found me, and somehow, life began again." Ezra finished for her. She nodded, relieved that he understood. "Yes." Ezra moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Abby, I can't offer you much. My faith is damaged. My life is simple, isolated. I'm not the man I was before Sarah died." "I'm not asking for that man," Abby said softly. "I'm asking about the man you are, now the one who saved my life, who has fought beside me for justice, who is finding his way back to faith, one difficult step at a time." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "That man is afraid," he confessed. "Afraid of losing again, afraid of failing you." "And hopeful?" she asked, searching his face. The corner of his mouth lifted in a tentative smile. "Increasingly so." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, vulnerable in a way that touched Abby deeply. She leaned her head against his shoulder, content for now with this quiet acknowledgement of possibility. They sat that way for a long time, watching the fire, listening to the storm, each lost in thoughts of what might lie ahead if they survived the dangers still facing them. On the morning of the 7th day, they woke to the sound of approaching horses. Ezra was instantly alert, reaching for the rifle. "Stay back," he told Abby, moving to the window. "It could be the marshal, but—" He peered cautiously through a gap in the curtains, then relaxed slightly. "It's Howard with 2 deputies." The marshal entered, stamping snow from his boots, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "Blackwood has convinced the governor to send troops against the Blackfoot, claiming they're harboring fugitives and have attacked territorial officials." "That's madness," Ezra protested. "Greyhawk's people have done nothing wrong." "I know that, but the governor's acting on the judge's information." Howard removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "There's more. Ritter has disappeared from custody. We don't know if he ran or was taken." Abby felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Without Ritter's testimony, their case against Blackwood weakened significantly. "When do the troops move against the Blackfoot?" Ezra asked. 2 days, weather permitting." "Then we have 2 days to stop Blackwood." Ezra's expression hardened with determination. "Marshal, I need to get to the governor. Tell him the truth." Howard shook his head. "The governor won't see you. Blackwood has convinced him you're both dangerous fugitives." "Then what do you suggest?" Abby asked, desperation edging her voice. "We can't let innocent people die because of us." The marshal hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "There is one option." The circuit judge arrives in Helena today, Judge William Sullivan. He outranks Blackwood in the territorial system and has the authority to issue a stay on the governor's orders if presented with compelling evidence. "Will he see us?" Ezra asked. "Not officially, no, but Sullivan and I served together in the war. He owes me a favor." Howard's expression was grave. "It's risky. If Blackwood's men spot you in town, they'll arrest you immediately." Abby and Ezra exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We'll take that risk," Abby said firmly. "For Greyhawk and his people. For justice." The marshal nodded respect, evident in his eyes. "I thought you might say that. Get your things. We leave within the hour." As they prepared to depart, Ezra drew Abby aside. "If anything happens," he said quietly, "if we're separated, know that you have brought light back into my life when I thought it was gone forever." The simple declaration made Abby's heart swell. She reached up, touching his bearded cheek gently. "And you've given me purpose when I had none. Whatever happens, Ezra, I don't regret a moment of it." For an instant, it seemed he might kiss her. Then the marshal called that it was time to leave, and the moment passed. They rode back to Helena with trepidation and determination in equal measure. The marshal's plan was to bring them into town after dark, through back streets to a boarding house where Judge Sullivan was staying. "My deputy will create a distraction at the hotel where Blackwood is lodging," Howard explained as they approached the town limits. "That should keep his men occupied while we meet with Sullivan." It was a good plan, but like many good plans, it didn't survive contact with reality. As they neared the boarding house, a shot rang out, spooking the horses. Abby's mount reared, nearly throwing her. Ezra reached out, steadying her, just as more shots followed. "Ambush!" the marshal shouted. "Get down!" Men emerged from the shadows, guns drawn. At their center stood Judge Blackwood, his face triumphant in the dim light of the street lamps. "Marshal Howard," he called. "Harboring fugitives now." "How disappointing." Howard drew his pistol. "Judge Blackwood, you're interfering with a territorial investigation." "Am I? Or am I assisting in the capture of two dangerous individuals who have slandered a public official and incited native violence?" Blackwood's smile was cold. "The governor will be most interested in your explanation." "The governor will be more interested in evidence of multiple murders." Ezra countered, his rifle trained on the judge. Blackwood laughed. "Evidence? Your so-called evidence is circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst. And your only witness has recanted his statement." He gestured, and from the shadows emerged Jacob Ritter, his face bruised, his eyes downcast. "I'm sorry, Reverend," the young man mumbled. "They threatened my sister." Abby felt hope slipping away. Without Ritter's testimony, they had little chance of convincing Judge Sullivan of Blackwood's crimes. "It's over," Blackwood declared. "Surrender now, and perhaps the charges can be reduced. Continue this foolishness, and you'll all hang for treason." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to back down. Then, from somewhere nearby, a church bell began to toll, slow and solemn in the night air. "That's St. Mary's," Howard said, puzzled. "Why would they be ringing at this hour?" The bell continued its mournful cadence, drawing the attention of townspeople who began to emerge from nearby buildings. "What is the meaning of this?" Blackwood demanded, his composure slipping slightly. As if in answer, a procession appeared at the end of the street, a line of people carrying lanterns led by a figure in clerical robes. As they drew closer, Abby recognized Reverend Matthews from the Pinecrest Church. Behind him walked Martha Blackwood, the judge's wife. The judge's face paled. "Martha, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her expression resolute despite her obvious fear. "Telling the truth, Garrett, finally." "What truth?" Blackwood's voice had lost its commanding tone, replaced by uncertainty. "About Sarah Hartfield. About Dr. Winters. About all of them." Martha's voice strengthened as she spoke. "I've known for years what you were doing. The medicines you tampered with the people who died so you could take their land. I kept silent out of fear, but I can't live with the guilt any longer." A murmur ran through the growing crowd of onlookers. Blackwood's men looked at each other uncertainly, their weapons lowering slightly. "She's confused," Blackwood insisted, but his authority was crumbling visibly. "My wife has been unwell." "I'm perfectly well, Garrett," Martha interrupted. "Well enough to have brought these." She held up a leather-bound book. "Your private ledger. The one you thought I didn't know about, with all your victims listed and the properties you acquired from their deaths." The marshal moved forward, hand extended. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I see that?" She surrendered the book without hesitation. Howard flipped through it, his expression hardening with each page. "Judge Garrett Blackwood," he said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for murder fraud and conspiracy against the United States government." "This is absurd," Blackwood sputtered. "You can't believe the ravings of a hysterical woman." "Not just her testimony," came another voice. Judge Sullivan, a distinguished man in his 60s, had emerged from the boarding house. "I've reviewed the evidence Marshal Howard gathered, including Dr. Winters' coded notes and the poison found in your study. Combined with your wife's testimony and this ledger," he shook his head gravely, "it's more than enough to convict you many times over." Blackwood's composure shattered completely. With a cry of rage, he drew a hidden pistol and aimed it at Martha. "You treacherous!" Ezra moved with surprising speed, throwing himself at the judge. The gun discharged as they fell, the bullet going wild. They struggled briefly before Howard and his deputies pulled them apart, securing Blackwood in handcuffs. "It's over, Judge," Howard said, his voice hard with satisfaction. "Your empire of death ends tonight." As Blackwood was led away, still shouting threats and denials, Abby found herself surrounded by townspeople asking questions, offering sympathy, expressing outrage at the judge's crimes. In the confusion, she lost sight of Ezra. When the crowd finally thinned, she spotted him standing apart in conversation with Martha Blackwood and Reverend Matthews. As she approached, she heard the judge's wife speaking earnestly. "I should have spoken years ago when Sarah died. Perhaps your child would have lived. Perhaps Dr. Winters—" She trailed off, overcome with emotion. "Can you ever forgive me?" Ezra was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Abby's surprise, he reached out and took Martha's trembling hands in his. "The Lord teaches us that forgiveness is not optional for those who seek it themselves," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It will take time, Mrs. Blackwood. But yes, I believe I can forgive you." The words, spoken with the authority of the pastor he had once been, brought tears to Abby's eyes. In that moment, she knew with certainty that Ezra had found his way back to faith, not the same faith he had lost, but something deeper tempered by suffering and stronger for it. As if sensing her presence, Ezra looked up, his eyes finding hers across the street. The connection between them was palpable, a current of understanding and shared purpose that had grown into something more precious than either had expected to find again. In his gaze, Abby saw not just the culmination of their journey for justice, but the promise of a new beginning together. Epilogue. The small chapel gleamed in the spring sunshine, its windows open to admit the fragrant breeze. Inside, flowers adorned the simple altar, and the pews were filled with a curious mix of people, townspeople, from Pinecrest, officials from Helena, and members of Greyhawk's Blackfoot tribe. The latter's presence, a powerful symbol of the changes that had come to the territory. At the altar stood Ezra Hartfield, no longer the isolated rancher, but once again a pastor, though of a different kind, one who had walked through the valley of doubt and emerged with a faith tempered by experience. Beside him stood Reverend Matthews, young and earnest, ready to perform the ceremony. When the chapel door opened, all eyes turned to see Abby enter, radiant in a simple white dress she had sewn herself. In her hands she carried wildflowers, the first blooms of spring gathered from the meadow where she and Ezra would make their home. As she walked down the aisle, her gaze never left Ezra's face. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been long and fraught with danger, but the reward was beyond anything either could have imagined when they first met on that stormy winter night. Judge Blackwood's trial had been swift and decisive. With Martha's testimony, the evidence from Daniel's notes, and the judge's own incriminating ledger, the outcome was never in doubt. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire of corruption dismantled. Greyhawk and his people had been exonerated, their actions recognized as protection of innocent lives rather than aggression. The territorial governor, humbled by his near-disastrous error in judgment, had established new provisions for cooperation between settlers and native tribes. And Jacob Ritter, after testifying truthfully at the trial, had found redemption and purpose as Ezra's assistant, helping to rebuild the small church on the ranch that would serve both settlers and Blackfoot alike. But perhaps the most profound transformation had been in Ezra and Abby themselves. Two broken people brought together by tragedy and a quest for justice had found healing in each other. The love that had grown between them was not the innocent passion of youth, but something deeper, a love built on shared purpose, mutual respect, and the kind of understanding that comes only through walking together through darkness into light. As Abby reached the altar, Ezra took her hands in his eyes shining with a joy she had never seen there before. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over them, sacred and binding. When it came time for their vows, Ezra spoke first, his voice steady and sure. "Abigail, when I found you in that storm, I thought I was saving your life. I didn't realize you would save mine, my soul, my purpose, my faith. I promise to love you, honor you, and walk beside you all the days of our lives." Tears glistened in Abby's eyes as she responded, "Ezra, you took me in when I had nothing, believed in me, when I doubted myself, and showed me that even the deepest wounds can heal. I promise to be your partner, your comfort, and your strength as you have been mine." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in cheers and applause. But for Ezra and Abby, the moment was quiet and profound, the culmination of a journey neither had expected to make, and the beginning of one they would walk together. As they turned to face their friends and community, Abby felt a strange sense of peace, as if somewhere Daniel and Sarah were watching their spirits at rest, now that justice had been done and new love had blossomed from the ashes of loss. Outside, the Montana spring continued its slow, steady awakening. The bitter blizzards of winter had yielded to gentle rains and warming sun. New life pushed up through soil once frozen and unyielding, a testament to the resilience of nature and the eternal cycle of renewal. For Ezra and Abby Hartfield, the prayers born in that terrible storm had been answered in ways neither could have imagined. They had found justice for those they had lost, healing for their wounded hearts, and a love that promised to grow stronger with each passing season. And in the end, Wasn't that the greatest miracle of all?